Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. Today we are in Prescott, Arizona and we are going to the Sharlot Hall Museum and I can't wait. This is going to be a great way to tie all the pieces of history together in one place. This is a really cool way to start this out. This is the Porter Engine 873, which is actually from the H.K. Porter Company. This was actually salvaged from a scrap heap, and at one point in time it looked like this right here, but it has been restored, and here it is today for us to see. Okay guys, so we are now at Sharlot Hall. Admission for adults is $12 and they do recommend that you allow at least an hour and a half to 2 hours to go through all of the buildings. There are 9 total on property and each one tells us a little bit more about something slightly different. So we're going to start off over here where they suggested that we go first, and this is actually the exhibit center right across from the entrance right over here. I'm very excited, so let's go. Now we were directed to the exhibit hall that talks a little bit more about Sharlot Hall as a whole. It tells a little bit more about the community and what the message of this particular museum is going to be for us. I'm really excited because I learned a little bit about this at the Museum for the Indigenous People, and in doing so I learned that they have a history of rodeo here and then a lot of other things. So I'm very excited to see how this unfolds as we walk throughout this hall. Now, following a brief introductory video, they have the museum start to unfold before us right here through these very halls. And we start off here with the founder of the museum herself. This was Sharlot Hall, and she wanted to save Arizona's history, and the territory had been founded between 1863 and 1900, and many early settlers had already passed away. So she found this was important to save their legacy. And so this museum was started by this woman who wanted to do this, but she did a lot of other things also. She was a collector, she was a politician, she was an activist, and she was also a historian. And throughout each of these displays, we learn a little bit more about why her legacy was carried on in the way that it has been even to this day, and what exactly that her purpose was in doing this particular museum. So I'm very excited to share a few of these historic photos and facts with you guys before we move into the next gallery. In fact, as soon as we walk in, we see this piggy bank that was used to collect museum funds, and then also a hammered copper bowl that was from United Verde Extension Mine in Jerome, and it was filled with money and presented to the museum in 1930. Now, the first museum looked very different. It was just a modest museum, but it looked something kind of like this. She signed the contract for this particular home to be built in 1927, and the Arizona Governor's Mansion was also used to facilitate a public museum. So it's pretty interesting to see these early photos in comparison to what this is now today. And as you go through these historic photos, it really puts into context how far the museum has come. Now, a little context. Whenever I went over to the Museum of Indigenous People, it used to be called the Smoke Eye Museum, and it was focused more on the native dances and the people, but they wanted something that would tell the stories of the settlers also, and they created the Sharlot Hall. A lot of the wealthy donors wanted to donate here because it was their relics, their artifacts, things like that. However, they also had to donate to the Smoke Eye Museum because that was actually put together to save the rodeo, for which this area was known so well for. So it was kind of an interesting balance, but this one grew much faster than the other museum as a result. Now, we also learn in this section that Sharlot was a woman who had a father that was in ranch work, and here we see a few of the images from their ranch, and then also some of the historic things that we would have noted her most for. In fact, born in Kansas in 1870, 1970, Charlotte was given her name by her uncle, who claimed it was actually an Indian name. And her earliest memories were of the Comanche raids through that area. Now here you can find some of Charlotte's legacy in ranching and some of the places around here, like the Lynx Creek. This was actually one of the mines there. Each of the sections talks about another facet of this amazing woman. It says here, as a woman, and then it's asking us to open the door to see more. But before we do, it has a quote here that we can read about. Let's open the door and see what's next. Oh wow, more historic photos. In fact, you can see here, this is Charlotte at age 18, and then also her traveling in 1910 in this corner. Here you can find a picture of her and one of her friends. And then here is her in California, probably at the home of Charles Loomis in 1905. We also learned that Charlotte was a writer and a poet, and in this particular display, you can see some of the things that she might have been affiliated with, including this book called Poems of a Ranch Woman. But she contributed to a lot of different things and was considered to be well educated and knowledgeable, and that is why her impact here was so grand. Now, we mentioned she was an activist. Her activism actually became crucial in the crusade against the congressional measure, which would have brought New Mexico and Arizona into the Union as one state. She advocated that there be a division and each one be able to stand their ground and be their own independent place. Charlotte went on to be the first salaried woman in government here in this area, and she actually led some different discovery missions and crusades. She ventured out to ruins. She documented meticulously the places that she would go to, and because of that, this is still considered to be named after her because of her contributions. So now that we've learned about Sharlot Hall herself, there's more galleries here that we can go through, and we're going to kind of go through each one of these and see what we can find. Now go into the prehistory of Western and Central Arizona. Did you know that mammoth or mammoths was actually meant originally to be an earth burrower by definition? We are asked here to look at this display and learn a little bit more about the 10,000-year-old beast that we now call a mammoth. But we learn a few things that are very interesting here about Arizona history and some of the things that have been excavated from the very areas that we are standing in today. In fact, we learned that this display highlights one specific mastodon that they found. It's one of only 9 that they found in the entire state. So this is a pretty big deal. And they're documenting what they've learned from this and what that we can go forward in learning as we move throughout the gallery. Okay, here we have a left tusk from a Columbian mammoth that they say was anywhere between 12 and 20 years old. In addition to that, we learned a little bit more about the adaptations of the teeth of these great beasts. And here it says there's actually 6 sets of teeth with 4 teeth per side. And these things could last up to 65 years of a lifetime. And the more that we explore, the more that we learn. We learned that they actually found extinct horses, camels, bison, and Columbian mammoths right outside of Prescott in the Prescott Valley. Now, the super interesting thing that I found about these displays is it not only tells you what they found, but they also ask some questions. For example, they noticed there was a sharp decline in these animals at a certain point, and they still don't know exactly why. And so they're questioning how this happened. Was it weather related? Was it human related? Was it other animals that were the cause? They simply just don't know, no matter how much research that they've been doing. So it's a continued process toward those answers. So maybe in time, we'll be able to come to this very museum and see an update because they've discovered something new. And I think that that's what's really cool about places like this, especially on the local level. Now, moving just past the first animals, we find the first Americans, and it asks us to question, who were they? Where did they come from? How did they get here? And when did they arrive? And throughout this display, you'll find a variety of different things that explain how the first people actually arrived here in this now country that we call the United States. There's a proposed migration route over 13,000 years ago that would have had people crossing across, and there are accounts in the Native American or First People American Indian views that kind of echo that right here in a very interesting way. And so you can put the pieces of the story together and learn a bit about these first people. And it's pretty fascinating whenever you see all of the different signage and can keep up with the story and learn the smaller pieces like this right here. What exactly is that? Well, it talks about the Clovis points that were found, and they were only found here in what was considered to be the New World, and they were designed using different things than had previously been used. And so they were said to have echoed that with the change of surroundings, that these new things would have been fashioned in order to be able to get food or protect tribes and things like that. And so it's interesting to see the evolution as the people came here of what that they determined that they needed and the new technology that they also created. So it's pretty fascinating to see who the first people truly were. And there's more. It says here that the first Americans left no evidence of permanent shelters or settlements, meaning that they were very nomadic. And in fact, their camps would be near their kill sites so that they could make it a short distance between where they were hunting and where that they were staying so that they could process the food. Organized bands of people would form up to 50 to 100 people at a time. But then they would also dissolve into family groups whenever the weather or scarcity would happen. And they were self-sufficient in doing so. So here we learn a bit more about that, and we're even able to see how they've correlated some of these first people to some of the things that we think existed far beyond. Now, we just spoke about the Clovis, but here it shows 13,000 years ago, Clovis points that were fashioned and that have been found. You can learn a lot about how they tooled these items through these displays, but in addition, they do have screens which tell you more, show you more about the regions that they can link these people to, and then even more information about how they would fashion their tools. But this is just the first of many displays in this room, telling us a little bit more about the history of Prescott here, and also some more of the stories of the first Americans. This is really fascinating. You can see all of the points on this map. Each one of those points represents a place where they have found Clovis points here in Arizona. They are scattered throughout. They were not in a single place. This leads them to believe that the migration paths and also the nomadic nature of these tribes would have been in order to hunt and to stay safe from the weather during different times of year. And they have also gone into other states and seen how the migration patterns would have led them to Arizona. It's pretty fascinating. We go on to find out that the archaic families, some of the earliest people, would regularly experience extreme hunger. And so their only option was to move forth so that they would not starve. And in doing so, they started to look into other methods, including agriculture. Here we learn a little bit more about the agricultural roots of Arizona that stemmed back to these first people. Now, something I've learned going site to site is that you can tie the pieces of the people together. In fact, if you're in Phoenix, you can go to Pueblo Grande and see some of the first dwellings. And then if you go also over to the Deer Valley petroglyph site, you can see some of the first writings by these people in this area. Now, Phoenix today would not be Phoenix had it not have been for these first people, because they started the irrigation canals, and then also when some of the settlers came in, they continued those projects onward. But the first people were doing this so that they could not have to move as much and they wouldn't have to worry about scarcity. Now, following starting some of these irrigation areas, they were able then to establish grains and things, and they could use these grinding stones to fashion it into a variety of different things. They also started to put together settlements that would have looked a little bit more like a permanent settlement versus the nomadic settlements that they were previously using. Okay, guys, this says open. What are we going to find? What are we going to find? Ooh, this is cool. This is actually a lot of different kinds of points that they have found, and they also link them to the individual peoples. That's really neat, but it also says something about the root of agriculture was actually started with seeds very much so similar to these. We then move into the Hohokum Impact, and we've learned a lot about them as we've traveled throughout, but especially whenever we were over at the Museum of Indigenous People, we were able to see some of the pieces and artifacts that they have found. This is a continuation of that, and definitely worth the deep dive as you look through each piece, but also as you open up the drawers and get a closer look at some of the different patterns that they used. They found a lot of interesting things about the Hohokum people, and in fact it says right here that they have found something that looks kind of like a ball court. In fact, it was an earthen baked, like flat area that resembled a stadium of sorts, which is wild because a lot of times we think that the modern things that we have now, we're just out of nowhere somebody decided to do this. But in fact, other people way before us were doing these things also, and we've adapted these things to our own, which is really fascinating to see that evolution. But there's more. Here we find some of the shell jewelry, and this was actually worn by Hohokum also. These were imported shells primarily from the Gulf of California, and then smaller amounts came from the Pacific coast. They were worn during rituals and depicted lizards, snakes, or even birds. Now, as we move into this gallery, we're moving into Prescotts Underground, the first Prescott culture, and it's going to tell us a bit more about what they've found and then also the settlements themselves. Pieces like this that were considered to be black on gray are said to be very signature to this particular region. Now, the Prescott look of grayware was considered to be different because it was collected from short distances away from the settlements, and because of that they had this different cast and tone to it. And it was considered to be the lesser attractive of some of the potteries that they found by the modern settlers. However, some of the details that they have here are just amazing, and you can see some of these are larger on this display and some are smaller. But it's pretty fascinating to see how the potters formed the bowls here, and that they would do so using wooden paddles very similar to this. Also learn about the Bantam League settlements, and these are one of the more fascinating components of the Prescott region according to an archaeologist. And you can see here some of the ruins out to the Fitzmaurice ruins in the 1950s. Now, in addition to those pottery pieces that we were talking about earlier, these are others that could be found throughout the state and that have been found in various places. In fact, as we look below, you can find where they have found each one of these and then what they have linked them to in way of dating them. And it is fascinating to see a collection of this size with all of this information all put together in such a easy to navigate way. Now, remember how we were talking about the rodeo? Well, this is actually focused on some of the faces that made the rodeo happen, but also some of the legacy of the rodeo itself. I found this sign to be extremely interesting because from place to place we've seen various information about the modern day cowboy and where he comes from, but also about the rodeo. And it says right here that they were actually originating from Spanish vaqueros and their traditions. In Spanish America, the rodeo was actually an annual process of moving and separating and gathering cattle into new pastures and different ranches. Because this was such a spectacle, festival would break out around it because it was a once a year kind of thing, and so everybody would want to take part. So they would have what we consider now some of the more normal traditions, where it would be about showmanship and who could do it better faster, and people would come out to cheer on their favorite vaquero. And in doing so, the rodeos themselves that we know now very similarly echo some of the things that would have happened in this thing of necessity that once was. So it became more of a spectator sport in more modern days than it was whenever it first originated. But it's kind of cool to see that history, but there's so much more in here, so let's go exploring. We learn here that on July 4th, 1888, the first professional rodeo actually took place here in Prescott, and merchants and professional businessmen organized a citizens committee and planned their first cowboy tournament, which is what they called it at that time. As you can see, they took from the Spanish vaqueros, they took a little bit from the knights and the jousting events that they did and turned it into something that was a fun, interesting, entertaining event here in the Prescott area. And they went through a lot of struggles along the way to keep this thing going. So as we move throughout, we learn a little bit more about what saved the rodeo, also why they thought that this was something that they wanted to call theirs, and the tradition that still continues today. Now, this is the interesting part. It says the evidence. Prescott's claim to the oldest rodeo is actually validated because they planned and organized the event in 1888, and then they also had members of the board. They charged admission, cowboys were invited, and they had an entire entire structure here, unlike some of the other gatherings that have boasted the same claim to fame. Now, if you guys have been to the World Championship Rodeo or have seen any of the championship titles, believe it or not, they started right here in Prescott. In fact, the World Championship Bronco riding contest started in 1913 during the Prescott Frontier Days. And you can see here that they have a rodeo program for that event, but they also have one of the bronc riders. And beginning in 1914, whoever won in Prescott was awarded the World Championship title. Believe it or not, this began to catch on, and the impact that Prescott had in the world of rodeo actually was quite huge, because by the 1920s, people started adapting their rules to mirror that of what was happening here in Prescott, Arizona. Now, what were those rules, though? Well, they were basically like a code of conduct for the cowboys. It says here that the code of conduct was several different things, and they could result in disqualification if they weren't doing them. This included that they wouldn't be able to ride in the parade, which was a really big deal. They also wouldn't be able to do several other things if they were rowdy, if they were quarreling, if they were mistreating their stock. All of these things became the new norm as the 20s shifted into the more modern era of rodeo. Now, they do have on display a few items here from throughout the years, including these two items that are from the Frontier Days. This one was from 1928. It was a contestant's number tag. And then here you have one of the pins, and then also the ribbons and some tokens that were used also from the 30s, and the 35 for this one right here. Now, here's when they kind of started to run into a little bit of the issues. After the 50th anniversary was celebrated in 1937, difficulty to raise money became a real thing. And so the town had to kind of shift their focus, because the war was really taking a turn within all things going on, but especially the rodeo realm. Now, local ranchers and farmers band together in the effort of trying to save their rodeo. And in doing so, a lot of things kind of started to pivot and shift from the old ways of doing things versus the new ways that they would need to do things. And in here, we can find the turning point of the rodeo really highlighted through each one of these plaques. And I definitely encourage you guys to read a little bit of this if you come here, because it's fascinating stuff. But I'll paraphrase for those who can't. Now, it basically says that many people attended the Chamber of Commerce meeting in 1965, and there was very little backing to actually drop the rodeo, but they didn't have money to finance it. So in 1966, the rodeo chairman actually left, and a new person volunteered for the position. Following the good news that there was a new person who was coming there, he immediately appointed a chairman, and under his direction, the rodeo started to make money again and started to be profitable. And because of that, the Prescott JCs took over the rodeo in 1968 and ran it for the next 11 years. Now, a very smart business move was made at this point. They encouraged Hollywood to come into the community of Prescott and to highlight their rodeo. And they did so through a movie called Junior Bronner, which starred Steve McQueen. And immediately people became more interested in not only the Prescott area, but rodeos in general once again. And it really invigorated the entire industry with a big boom. By 1979, they were celebrating the new formed group, the Prescott Frontier Days Incorporated. And it had only one thought and one purpose, and that was to put on a rodeo every year. In 1985, they went on to patent the name the world's oldest rodeo, and it still to this day is called that based on that patent, which is really, really neat. But a few other things that are kind of cool about this particular community and this particular rodeo, it says right here in July of 2008, Prescott Frontier Days Incorporated Committee was inducted into the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame, which is a huge accomplishment for anyone who is affiliated with rodeo. So that's a pretty neat honor. But do you guys see this right here? It says that it's one of only 16 rodeos at the time to have this honor bestowed upon them. Now, they also hold the title for the second largest parade in Arizona, and there are over 200 working members of the board and the cooperation altogether that make this happen every year. So it's a huge entity. It's not something that is very small, it's massive. And it's something that people flock to this area to come to. One of the 8 performances during this Frontier Days. It's pretty fascinating. And so that gives us the backstory of the rodeo. But there's a few other things in here I want to highlight for you guys before we head out into the other parts of the museum. I think you're going to like them. Inside this display, we have a variety of different saddles that have been used through the Frontier Days celebration, in addition to some really cool historic ones up there on the wall from the 1920s. And they're pretty neat because one of these actually ties back to Texas, where I'm from. See this one right here? Larry Mahan. He's actually a person who lives in the Texas area now, and this was one of his rigging saddles that was used in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, fun story about Larry Mahan. My old boss, whenever I worked for a newspaper, actually knew Larry pretty well. So I had the opportunity to meet Larry, and it was really a neat conversation. Very cool person. So neat to find a saddle of his all the way here in Arizona. In addition, there are historic photos of the rodeo here in Prescott throughout the years, and you can see some of the queens and then also some of the ranch hands that are just getting together and doing the hard work. It is fascinating to see this display. Then there is an interactive display here where you can find the picture and say what you think it is. So for example, what would you think this one is? Take a good look. Did you guess that it is bulldogging or steer wrestling? In fact, this is one of the many things that are included in the rodeo contests of even today. And it's pretty fascinating to see how they've highlighted each of these where you can have that flippable interactive experience. And speaking of Steve McQueen, in that movie from 1972, here is an entire section called Junior Bonner. And here you can find photos, historic text, pieces from the newspapers, a little bit of everything, but there's something else pretty cool. They have the cowboy hat that was actually worn by Steve McQueen in the film, and they also have a cowboy hat that was owned by Casey Tibbs, who was considered to be one of the world's all-time best championship cowboys, having won the world championship numerous years. I'm going to leave this section so you guys can explore a little bit of movie magic yourself to find out a little bit more about the contributions from this movie to Prescott itself, but it is time for us to go outside and check out these other 8 buildings. We have a lot to do and a little time to do it. Let's get going. Now, as we move on to the next buildings, these are all brought here and have symbolic reasons as to why. This was actually brought here to Prescott by Margaret McCormick. She was the wife of the 2nd governor of the Arizona Territory in 1865. So let's go see what this house has to offer. Interestingly enough, this was the 1964 governor's mansion, and this building was actually a home of the first 2 governors of Arizona, and they called it a mansion even though it's not considered to be a mansion by today's standards. This was considered to be a very large home. So as we look into each one of the rooms, we can see how it might have been furnished at the time, and a few little fun facts. Here we find the territorial secretary, Richard McCormick from New York, who went on to become the 2nd governor, and also the 1st territorial governor, John Goodwin. He was from Maine, and he served from August 1863 to April of 1866. Now, this is also significant because Sharlot Hall actually moved her collection to this building, and it was reopened as a museum in 1927, even before realizing the full potential of what this museum could be. This was where we all started. Now here you can learn a little bit more about how the governor's house would have been built, and they would have used a very interesting technique that was popular at the time for building log homes. They would have used this particular stacking method for the logs, but then they would have used things in between to fill in the gaps, and those things would have been able to expand and contract with the weather to keep it airtight. Now, this is an interesting room because it's considered to be the governor's storehouse. And so you can find all of these different things that might have been stored here and used by the governor. And so it's pretty interesting to see how they have each one of the boxes where it's lit up, and then you can look inside and see what they might have had. Now, something that would be a little bit different from the governor's house to just an average home would be they have much better quality of overall items, because that would be something that would be considered more high society. So as you're looking around, you can look into each one of these and see some of the weapons, some of the tools, some of the items that might have been found in the governor's mansion at any given time. Now, why is it all in boxes though? Because they didn't have all of these items here when it was a territory. It would have to be brought in different ways. And a lot of these things would come from quite a far distance away, and they would be in these packing containers and then brought here and then used whenever they needed them. Now, that meant that some of these items would be extremely luxurious because a lot of people couldn't have afforded to ship them here. So inside here you'll find very opulent items. And just across from the governor's mansion, another hall filled with knowledge and brain wrinkles. Let's find out what we can learn here. Here we learn a bit more about rail travel and how Arizona was connected by railways to the remainder of the nation. Now, some of those railways would have been being laid in the earliest stages of the territory and still are used today. And so here you can find various locomotives, various places that the trains would have been being built, and then some of the interesting items. Now, this was pretty interesting. This is actually the early Central Arizona railroads, and you can see many of them do connect here in Prescott because Prescott was twice considered to be the capital of the state. We also get to learn a little bit more about the ranch work and how it's changed over time. And through this, we find a chuck wagon, which is basically a traveling kitchen that had to carry every single thing because there weren't just stores and there weren't places that you could just pull in and grab a burger. They would have to have everything available to them when they were working these areas. So there would be someone who would be responsible for this daily. We learn about cattle branding and some of the difficulties, including the harsh winters and the predators and then the thieves, all of which would ravage the community and also would result in lost cattle. But here you can find various artifacts and historic photos about Prescott's earliest days and how the Arizona legislature actually ruled that all brands be burned onto leather and registered in the appropriate county with the recorder. No duplicates were allowed, and that was because of all of the craziness going on with the cattle. Here we see an early pioneer woman and her daughter doing laundry. Laundry was no frills back then, way harder, and it was considered to be something that was a skill and it was considered to be one of the tasks for women. Women had specific tasks at their homes, including the caring for the children, the washing, the cleaning, the cooking, and all of the indoor chores. Outside women were supposed to care for gardens, chickens, and only milk cattle. Now, this section's pretty interesting because it tells us a little bit more about life here in Prescott, and it breaks it down into a variety of different subjects, so let's dive in. Starting off with who Prescott was actually founded and named for, and it was this guy right here, William Hickling Prescott, and he was born in 1796, passed away in 1859, and was never actually in Arizona before he died and before the territory was founded. However, it does go into more detail about the people that we just learned about, the first people who lived in this area, and that as time passed, there were a variety of different people who came through this area. And so each one of these little displays shares a little bit more of that overall story. And then we start to learn about what we now call Whiskey Row. In fact, Montezuma Street, all the way west to Granite Street, was known for saloon keepers, fancy women, and gamblers who mined after being in the mines all day. So here we can see a little bit more about what Whiskey Row was all about with some historic context, including some very interesting photos like this one right here, which was a famous belly dancer from Little Egypt. We've seen a lot of general stores in our travel, but here they actually had markets for merchandise, and it was considered to be a bit more fancy. Here you can also ring up your sales through one of these interactive exhibits, which allows you to punch the keys, and as a result, the cash drawer pops out. Now, unlike some of the traditional general stores, the marketplaces here were a bit more lavish and had more items designed for the up and up in the community as well as the everyday person. So here you could see some of the photos of these much more high-scale markets, and they were large and they were huge, and a lot of times they had a lot of things that you wouldn't traditionally find in a regular town. In fact, because of its position in society, because there were so many politicians in this region, they wanted to have the nicest of things. So a lot of times they would special order items like finer quality silks and patterns and things like that that the women would want to use. But also they would have the finer cigars and things like that for the menfolk. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, of course, we've seen a fire wheel before where it hauls around the hose and it would be connected to either a person pulling it or a horse. But right across from this, we actually learned that here in Prescott, they really needed these because fire ravaged many frontier towns, including Prescott. And here we find a picture of just the kind of devastation that actually occurred right here in this community as a result of some of these fires. Now, at one point, they also stopped implementing rules that allowed for structures to be built of wood because of this devastation. So only fireproof structures could be built, and that meant brick. Now, it's kind of interesting to see some of these early pictures of what Whiskey Row used to look like before it was built of brick. These were just humble structures that were built of wood and basic materials such as tin on the roof. But after this new ruling, everything changed, and now we see the Whiskey Row that we know today. Now, just outside, there is actually a beautiful rose garden area that has just been recently pruned so that it can grow for the spring and summer. However, this is a memorial to all the territorial women, and all of these women right here are memorialized through that garden, which is really fabulous. Now, in addition to the territorial women, there were territorial men, many of which came here as a result of the gold rush. And here you can find some of the mining history of the Prescott region, including some of the items that they have found that were used at one point, some of the attire, a lot of historic photos, and the hope and promise for finding gold was very real in this region. This began because near Wickenburg and Prescott both, they found gold. And in doing so, it exploded people influxing into this area because they all wanted their chance to strike it rich also. Especially during this time, a lot of people didn't have a whole lot. So the thought of being able to find gold and potentially change their stars was a really big deal. So it encouraged a ton of people to just start moving into the territory. Sometimes that resulted in people finding fame and fortune. Other times it resulted in people having a very different experience filled with hard labor and not a lot of success. Now, just beyond that, we also find this display about Fort Whipple. Fort Whipple is located just outside of Prescott, toward Prescott Valley, and it's actually still a place that you can go and tour, although I have been told that they're currently renovating it, so we're not going to get to go just yet. But here you would have found a bit of a look behind the scenes of those who were at Fort Whipple, and as you can see, it's a very different experience from some of the other people that we've been seeing in these displays. In fact, in the back here, you can see some of the first telegraph machines, and in 1861, the first transcontinental telegraph was connected between San Francisco to the east. The Army completed the Arizona's earliest telegraph line in 1873, and it linked the territory to other military posts. And so because of that, it was able to do great things. Now, believe it or not, the original Fort Whipple soldiers were actually led by Yavapai and Apache scouts. It says right here that many of the scouts believed that these kind of cooperations were a way to achieve peace. And so there wasn't always turmoil between the groups. However, we all know that whenever it went south fast. So the cooperation between these groups was apparent during this time and is reflected throughout this display through some of the written text. It's pretty interesting. Now, it's hard to see but there are murals all around the top portion of this room that are fabulous. But we are moving right now into the next room, which has a very interesting look and display that I am so excited to tackle with you all. This actually says The Baskets Keep Talking, the continuing story of the Yavapai Prescott Indian tribe. Now, this says it all right here. It says, none of the dead can rise up and answer the questions, but from what that they have left behind, their imperishable or slowly dissolving gear, we may perhaps hear voices. Now, when we were at the Museum for the Indigenous People, we learned a lot about the baskets and how that they would fashion these to tell stories through patterns and the items that they would use to create these. But this is like a deep dive that correlates with that to tell you a little bit more about what could have been with each of these baskets and what we can learn from them, and also how we can learn about the people themselves just by looking at what they have left behind. In fact, it mentions here that some of the basket uses could be for cooking, parching, granary, winnowing, leaching, shields. They could also be used as a hat. In some cases, they built houses, clothing, shades, bird cages, all sorts of different things out of each of these basket types. And in fact, as we move through each one of these displays, it tells us more about each of these people and their many uses for these kinds of baskets, and also what they were made out of and the different symbols behind each one of them. This is fabulous. Much like at the Indigenous Museum, we learn about the different items which would have been used to create the baskets, and we also learn a word, bouvis, which means to weave. I think one of the most important things that we can learn from this display, though, is what is here at the end. It says, "We are still here." And so these are voices from the past talking to us, but also echoing the current residents of these areas. And I think that that's really remarkable and also something that is amazing. I want to talk more about these kinds of voices because a lot of times their written documentation of history has been removed from us. And so it's really important for us to take time in places like this, which is why I encourage you guys to read all the signs. Just this one section by itself could be a full hour of time if you're reading everything, and I don't want to do that to you guys on the video because we need to see the whole property, but I definitely encourage you to do this. Okay guys, as we have departed this particular exhibit, it's time to go off to a couple of other ones. Now there are several smaller outbuildings, so we're going to take a look at each one of them and kind of get an idea as to what goes on inside of them or why they're significant to the museum and why they brought them here. We're going to start off, I think, with a little cabin in the woods. Well, not so much in the woods, but you know what I'm talking about. This cabin is located next to the Rose Garden, and this is a little ranch house. Oh, this is neat. It talks to you and tells you about ranch life. And so as we're kind of looking through here, you can listen and learn the stories. Now I'm gonna show you the place and let you listen to a little bit of this.
Worked to create this exhibit building as a tribute to early ranchers and the life she and so many others had lived on the frontier.
Most ranch houses had a single multi-purpose room with a fireplace. Family members all cooked, ate, slept, and bathed in this one room. When it was possible.
Pretty neat. Definitely like whenever there is an exhibit that allows us to really interact with the space around us. That one definitely was. It's literally telling you what you're seeing, why it's there, and you can read along with the signage on the wall also to learn a little bit more of the fun fact side of the ranch house. Now, this was not an original ranch house that was brought in. They actually built this here on property so that they could use it for the museum to commemorate the ranch people, and I think that that's really awesome. But this next one is called Fort Misery. What? Fort Misery is the oldest log cabin in Arizona, and it was moved here in the 1934 time. That's really awesome. So we're going to be literally looking at the oldest piece of Arizona history that they know of when it comes to the cabins and the spaces that like people who were coming here, the settlers and pioneers, would have used. So that's really cool.
Flurry in his cuisine at the governor's mansion. My friends jokingly dubbed the place Fort Misery, and the name stuck, not because...
Now this is pretty interesting. This place served as the first store. It served as the first boarding house. It was the first home. It was the first law office. And believe it or not, they called it Fort Misery because, well, it has a really interesting past because life was just kind of hard then. But something else that we learned is that a lot of times whenever we come into places like this and we see signs like this about the door being low and to stoop down, we just think it's because people were short. Mind you, people had a different body structure back then, but it is not in fact because they were short. It's because of how they had to distribute the weight for everything to be able to be held up with the sod roof itself. So that is really fun fact, and as we duck to get out of here to go over to the schoolhouse, I'm glad we got that new brain wrinkle. Okay, this is a replica of the first schoolhouse, and it was actually built in 1962. So they used the same techniques that were used over here on the oldest building to create this new structure. Now, I always find schoolhouses to be interesting because now we have to have these massive campuses with all these crazy things, but these were much more primitive, and the things that they learned were much different than what we learn now based on how the world around us has changed. So let's go inside and see what this one has to show us.
Another was assigned to take the water bucket to the kept with it in a corner, and everyone used it for drinking.
Okay, let's practice our oral resuscitation.
Okay, inside we learned that school here in the Prescott area was held during the winter months. It only lasted a few months because they needed the kids to be able to be a part of the growing season and the harvest season and things like that. Now, this one-room schoolhouse just had benches. This one didn't even have actual desks. But in schools like this, they would just seat them according to height. So the young kids would be in the front, the older kids would be in the back, and that way everybody could see. And the curriculum was not divided up based on the grade level. It was actually something that was kind of a little bit different. They had practical skills that everyone could learn, and then they would teach everyone kind of in unison all the different levels all at the same time, which is really insane to think about. But at the same time, there weren't very many kids actually in these schools at any given time either, so it wasn't as like compact as we are now. Now, just beside that, they have this great amphitheater area where they do presentations here on special occasions, and some beautiful landscape. Let me show you what this place looks like. It's gorgeous, guys. Now here you'll also find the Black Canyon Highway marker, and this says that construction actually began in 1947 whenever Sidney Osborne was the governor. It was completed in 1961 when Paul Fannin was the governor. Just beyond that, we find the blacksmith, and you can learn a little bit more about what it would have been like to be a blacksmith and some of the tools that would have been used. Now, they do actually do demos here of the blacksmith shop, so if you come, ask if they're doing a demo. Today they're not, but this is a really cool way to see how things are made, and then also some of the cool things that they would have had to do. Now, a blacksmith was one of the most important people in town. In fact, every town needed a blacksmith. Not wanted, but needed, because they fashioned everything from horseshoes, which were super important at the time, to also tools and items for wagons and cars later on even. It's kind of interesting to see the evolution of the blacksmith and how we still to this day use blacksmiths in a variety of different ways and maybe just give them a different job title. Now, believe it or not, a 60-hour week back in 1880, a blacksmith would have made about $15, a little bit over $15 for 60 hours in a week. Now, that's a very interesting wage, but at the time that was thought to be a good wage for such hard work. Next to the blacksmith, we have a good example of what a mercantile might have looked like with some of those various items. Now, we talked a little bit more about the mercantile when we were in the last building, but it's kind of interesting to see how they would have had shelves that would have had everything from dishes and items that you would have used in your home to molds for shoes, saddles, all sorts of different kinds of fabrics, grains, things like that. And then there's the print shop. We know I like a good print shop. Now, the print shop actually represents a very small job or newspaper shop of Arizona territorial period. Between 1863 and 1912, you could have seen a print shop just like this one. The presses are used in the shops. These presses were very unique, and at the time you would have to put in single individual letter characters in order to create text. Okay, let's see what's next. Next building, here we go. Wow. Okay, the house that we just entered into is actually the Fremont house here, and it's kind of got an interesting story. The Fremont family actually was associated with the territorial governorship. In fact, Mr. Fremont was the 5th territorial governor, and we learned that while he was serving as the governor, he actually rented this home. Now, this home has been moved, and in doing that, they've actually had to do a little bit of reconstruction, but they believe this to be as close to the house as possible because because the girls actually kept diaries, which allowed them to know that they had carpet and wallpaper and how the orientation of the house looked, what kind of things they might have had inside. It's kind of a fascinating story when you come in here. And they do have people who sit inside the buildings and tell you a little bit more about it, which I really appreciate. Now, inside this building, however, you can see some of the finishings and furnishings that might have been about that time period. And so here you can find, instead of having deep fireplaces like we saw in the cabin, they actually had these beautiful, ornate stoves that would have kept the heat in the homes. Now, like many homes we visited, you'll find windows abound throughout. And that's because they didn't have air conditioning like we do today. So this would allow them to open up the windows and get some airflow into the space. Now, as you can see, the house itself was spectacular, but there were a couple little nuggets in there. For example, those black sofas and the chair. Did you know that those are actually made out of horsehair that has been woven very gently together? That is crazy. They also had a hair wreath, which was actually kind of a common art practice, which is also considered kind of strange now, but at the time seemed perfectly normal. But another thing that I wanted to share with you guys about the Fremonts, Mr. Fremont actually struck it big in California. He found gold and had a ranch out there. He was exploring and was known to be an elite explorer for the whole western region. In fact, many things in the West still to this day are named after Mr. Fremont, including a few things that you might be familiar with. Fremont, California, Fremont, Oregon, and Fremont Street in Las Vegas. It's now time for us to go to the transportation building through these doors. This was originally a machine shop, but now has a vehicle collection. This was built in 1937, so this building has been a part of the structure here since very early on, and I'm very excited about this. Now, as we walk in, we learn about wagons, and these were considered to be the work trucks of the day, and most of them were pulled by horses or mules, and they would carry very heavy loads. Now, these were an essential piece of early Prescott because they needed these in order for them to be able to do many of the things, including their farm work. Now, most people are super familiar with the stagecoaches, however, and these were actually created for several different things. Some of them would haul mail, some of them would haul people, and prior to the railroad, these were the main form of transportation for a lot of people. And you could see that this was a sizable difference from the typical wagon, so it would take a lot more horsepower in order to get down the roadways. Let's talk about those roadways. They were not nice, they were not good, they were not even, they were not paved, they were bad roads. So this was a very bumpy ride, and it was also sometimes a very costly ride depending on where you were going to, but this was the most recognized form of transportation for most people for a very long time. And then they have a couple of other ones that are kind of also interesting. They also had covered wagons. In fact, these boat-shaped wagons were actually used and were called prairie schooners. They would go across the prairies and bring goods and supplies, and many times whenever people were coming toward the west, they would load their family up in one of these with everything that they possessed and make the treacherous path all the way to their newfound home. These were extremely popular, but also they were something that was, again, not very glamorous, not very easy to maneuver. Now, as times changed, you started to see things like this. This is a 1917 Model T pickup, and this was a Ford product. This was one of the first actual motorized vehicles in this region. Then you get to something a little bit more upgraded like this. This was a touring car from 1927. These were considered to be horseless carriages, and they became the new thing. People wanted to trade in their wagons and get something like this so that they could be more comfortable and more luxurious. But at the time, these were also very costly. Now, something else I want to feature in here is all of these different kinds of baskets and also cutters and runabouts. These are all different kinds of transportation that would have been used in the Prescott area during various time frames. And you can even see in the back there a sled, because we are at a little bit of a higher altitude and they do get snow here. And then there's the humble bicycle. Bicycles were an easy form of transportation, and as you can see, they've changed a lot over time. From the traditional old school to the more modern two-seater tandem here that you see, to something a little bit less traditional like this tandem bike. Again, this place is expansive. If we were to go into each and every individual plaque, we would be on this video for hours. hours. They allot that you should have at least an hour and a half to 2 hours, but realistically, if you were to read every single sign at this museum, you could be here all day. And I've definitely overstayed my 2 hours. I really like to deep dive with you guys though and share some of these stories because I think that these stories should be told, and that's why places like this are so awesome. But we have one last building to go to, and then we are going to exit through the gift shop. It's time for us to go through the Bashford house. Now, this particular building is really interesting because it intertwines not only the history of the home, but also the gift shop, which has some pretty spectacular things in it. It asks us to ask, who lived here? It started as a small Victorian house, and here we see in 1878 that William Coles Bashford and his wife Mary Louise bought this newly built single-story home in the southeast corner of Pleasant and Gurley Street, so not too far from where it sits today. It also tells us a little bit more about Cole and Levi, the Bashford brothers, and how they really won the West. And it goes on to tell us a little bit more about B&B, which was actually considered Prescott's biggest store. And it was run by, you guessed it, the Bashford brothers. Okay guys, that's gonna wrap it up here at Sharlot Hall. This is an amazing museum. I definitely recommend you guys coming out. $12 is a low price point for what we just learned. It was amazing, and you could literally spend hours here. I remember coming to a museum similar to this in Texas and discovering things for the first time, and being able to put together some of those pieces here in Arizona too, definitely worth it. Remember, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time, so I'll see you guys next time. Bye!